Who was the man who conceived the idea of building a castle, not just large, but twice the size of the famous Mentmore Towers? Why is the most luxurious 19th century chateau in France almost forgotten? And why did its history turn out to be so dramatic that it seems torn from a novel? Before you is the secret life of Château de Ferrières, the Rothschild palace that France has almost forgotten. Let's start with James de Rothschild. He was not just a banker, he was the head of the French branch of the legendary family, a man whose ambition surpassed all earthly wealth. In the 19th century, his name was synonymous with financial power, and he wanted his home to reflect this power not with words, but with stone, glass, and space. It seemed incredible that a simple baron would want to build a mansion capable of hosting not just 2 or 3 important guests, but an entire aristocracy and kings. At first glance, Château de Ferrières is simply beautiful architecture. But behind the facade lies a history of contrasts. A modest farmhouse, purchased in 1829, grows into a monumental palace, valued as the most luxurious 19th century chateau in France. And no one could have predicted that a century later, it would endure devastation, occupation, oblivion, before coming back to life, but in a new role. And in this dual space, between past and future, wealth and loss, a drama unfolds that few know. How could the man who created the chateau end up ruined despite his fortune? How could a great family owning such a palace decide to hand it over into foreign hands? And what does its silent grandeur say about this place today? This story is not just about a palace. It is about a man whose ambition and strategy cultivated a masterpiece. It is about a home that became a symbol not only of wealth, but also of inner emptiness and transformation. And perhaps about a legacy that is much deeper than marble and glass. Behind the doors of Ferrières lies much more than you think, and its secrets are only just beginning. The origins of Château de Ferrières' story go far beyond its marble facades, into a world where the Rothschild banking dynasty built not just a financial empire, but an entire universe of influence. James de Rothschild, born in 1792, was one of the key figures of the family's French branch. When he acquired the Ferrières-en-Brie estate in 1820, there stood an old, modest castle belonging to the heirs of Joseph Fouché. James was not merely a banker living in luxury. His entire worldview was imbued with the idea of progressive power. He saw wealth not as hidden capital, but as a tool for conquering cultural and social space. His convictions were built on calculation and aesthetics. The status of the Rothschild family had to be expressed not only in account figures, but also in architecture, education, and art. He began to act strategically. First, he accumulated land around the estate. Then he invited an architect who could embody his ambitions in stone. Thus, James was laying the foundation not only for a palace, but also for a symbol of a new lineage whose money and taste were simultaneously a cultural force. The social conflict he faced can be imagined as a clash of new money with the more traditional gentry, the old aristocracy of the Second Empire. For many, his ambitions might have seemed too loud, even provocative. But for him, it was not a challenge. It was a strategy. He was not a dreamer who simply loved luxury. He was a strategist who calculated that his palace would become a place where not just guests, but the world's elite, kings, and cultural luminaries would gather. He understood that power was not only about finances, but also about symbols, and luxury could be the most potent language of influence. At the same time, he was not unambiguous. Yes, he had enormous resources, but he wasn't simply chasing ostentation. Within his motivation, there was calculation. He dreams, but does so like an entrepreneur, meticulously planning every step. The rise of Ferrières began with an alliance that changed everything. Not just a merging of capital, but a meeting of two worlds. The second key character in this story is not a competitor, but precisely an ally, the architectural genius Joseph Paxton, invited by James de Rothschild to create the palace the banker himself had dreamed of. Paxton had already become famous thanks to the Crystal Palace, built in London, and had a direct connection to Mentmore Towers, an estate belonging to another branch of the Rothschild family. It was James, upon seeing the kindred Mentmore, who reportedly told Paxton, "Make me a Mentmore, only bigger." This strategic alliance meant much more than just commissioning an architect. It was an act of declaration. The Rothschild lineage of France was not merely participating in the aristocratic circle. It was the creator of a new cultural space, whose place was comparable to that of the British English gentry. Paxton, an architect with an international reputation, brings his architectural philosophy, his passion for glass, iron, and innovative forms, and thereby transforms the face of Ferrières. Construction begins in 1855. Construction lasts until 1859. At the heart of the project is not merely an enormous house, but a grandiose building in the Neo-Renaissance style, which combines elements of the Italian Renaissance and English forms. Furthermore, Paxton doesn't just build, he designs an idea, a house designed for 100 servants and accommodation for 80 horses, according to the Rothschild Family Archive, family.rothschildarchive.org. And an important architectural move, the kitchen was placed separately from the main building so that cooking odors would not penetrate the master's bedrooms, and food was delivered via underground routes. Narrow underground rails led from the kitchen to the palace halls. Thus, a symbolic fusion is formed. A new financial dynasty, aspiring to aristocratic status, unites with an architect whose style and technical approach represented modernity. This alliance is not merely a construction deal, but a strategic investment in a symbol of power and culture. With the emergence of Ferrières, James's position in society changes. He is no longer merely a banker, he is the owner of a palace that can compete with royal residences. His status becomes not a financial abstract, but a tangible one, a home capable of hosting the highest nobility, the emperor himself. And on this scale, a new object emerges, not merely a castle, but a living symbol of influence. Ferrières becomes not merely a residence, but a platform for ambitions, a place where bankers become not just wealthy individuals, but architects of their own legend. The first impression of Château de Ferrières is the silence of its scale. The building, completed at the end of 1859, stands above the landscape like a monument of the Second Empire era. A rectangular volume, 2 terraces, 4 corner pavilions, Neo-Renaissance style facades that seem deliberately to emphasize the owner's ambition. When a guest passed through the main gates, they left the world of rural Île-de-France and entered a space where every line was calculated, every column a statement. An atmosphere not of luxury but of power, expressed through aesthetics. This was precisely the psychological reflection of James de Rothschild, a restrained facade behind which lay a program of absolute control over the environment. Upon entering, the guest found themselves in a large central hall, a space many times a person's height, illuminated through a glass ceiling, created in the spirit of Paxton's love for light and structures. The ceiling glass made the sun's rays almost palpable. Light didn't just illuminate, it moved along the stone walls, making metal and gold shimmer. This was a contrast to the external monumentality. Inside, the light created the impression of a living breath, as if the house watched every step. From the hall, the path led to spacious drawing rooms. The first, the Grand Salon, decorated with paintings from the Rothschild collection. Italian canvases, Flemish masters, 17th century French painting. Here, wealth was expressed not by the quantity of decor, but by the provenance of the objects. Each object brought from a specific European art center, each frame a testament to the taste of a family that had shaped collections for centuries. This salon was a showcase of intellectual power, but a few steps away, and the mood changed. Nearby was the small salon, a much more intimate space with wooden panels, soft light, and furniture upholstered in warm-toned fabrics. It created a feeling of almost domesticity. The contrast between the rooms turned a journey through the house into an emotional pendulum. Grandeur, and then sudden intimacy. Openness, and then almost seclusion. Next, the dining room, designed for receptions of dozens of guests, where dishes arrived via underground routes from a detached kitchen. This was not merely a technical detail. It symbolized the owner's desire to separate the world of convenience from the world of display. In the dining area, there were to be no reminders of work. Everything was focused on the ritual of elite socializing. But move further on, and the atmosphere changed again. The library became James's most expressive portrait. Instead of ostentatious luxury, order, silence, austere bookshelves, where manuscripts and editions stood in systematic order. Many visitors noted the contrast. A man known for his receptions and lavish balls creates a space almost ascetic in spirit. According to researchers, the library reflected his inner need for control and knowledge, an assumption, but a logical one, considering documents about his collecting of rare editions. The rooms on the upper floors continued this architectural psychology. Guest bedrooms, numbered, were arranged in such a way as to isolate them from service corridors. The house contained over 100 rooms, and the distribution of space showed that while every guest felt important, no one gained full control over the house. Power remained in the hands of the owners. Ferrières was not just a house, it was an architectural system in which light, shadow, the height of the halls, the number of service rooms, and the provenance of the furniture. Everything spoke of the Rothschild's worldview, and everyone who entered here felt the invisible presence of those who once made decisions that influenced Europe. But behind Ferrières' marble staircases lay a human drama far more painful than any crack on an old facade. The main heir, for whom the palace became not just a residence but a part of family identity, was Edward Alphonse James de Rothschild, born in 1868, the grandson of the very James who conceived its construction. He inherited Ferrières and managed it throughout the first half of the 20th century. It was his lot to experience the most difficult period in the family's history. The external grandeur of the castle came into direct conflict with what was happening in the lives of its owners. Tragedy came not from within the family, but from without. With the outbreak of the Second World War and the invasion of France in 1940, Ferrières found itself at the epicenter of political and military pressure. The Rothschild family, like many French Jews, was forced to leave the country. Edouard left for the United States of America. His decisions during these months are known only through documents. He tried to save collections, property, and archives, but was unable to evacuate a significant portion. The house, conceived as a symbol of strength, stood empty, abandoned to the mercy of circumstances. It is here that a moral ambivalence arises, which makes this story tragic. Ferrières was not destroyed by military action. It was transformed into a headquarters for Nazi command. This is documented. Representatives of the occupying forces used the castle as an operations center and a warehouse for seized works of art. The Rothschild collections, among the most valuable in Europe, were confiscated. Some of them were on lists compiled by the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, a structure involved in the looting of cultural assets. But even more painful was that the house, created as a gathering place for the elite, became a platform for foreign power, a symbolic transformation of luxury into an instrument of control. The second character in this turning point was Germaine Halphen, Edouard's wife, who married him in 1907. She was not the architect of decisions related to property, but her role during the family's exile is described in separate testimonies. It was she who maintained contact between family members, coordinated correspondence, and helped preserve what could still be preserved from a distance. Her intervention did not change the history of the castle, but it changed the history of the family. She preserved the family identity at a time when the house itself was lost. In this contrast, external splendor and internal helplessness, arises the main moral question: can grandeur protect against collapse? Dom Ferrières, created as a symbol of strength, did not protect its creators. And Edouard, a highly influential man in pre-war France, found himself forced to fight not for status, but for the very possibility of returning to life after the war. Ferrières, which seemed eternal, showed its fragility. The house stood, but its owners did not. It is precisely here that the story moves to the moment when values must be re-evaluated. The crisis that befell Ferrières during the Second World War was not just an episode. It turned into a point of no return. The house, created as a demonstration of resilience, turned out to be a perfect illusion. It survived the invasion, but lost its purpose. When German units left the castle in 1944, traces of the occupation remained inside. The emptiness of the halls, lost collections, and the feeling of an invisible scar. It is from this moment that the transformation begins, which would determine the fate of Ferrières for the subsequent decades. According to archival data, Edouard Alphonse James de Rothschild returned to France after the end of the war, but his connection to the castle was no longer the same. He did not restore within it permanent life. And the realization of the scale of confiscations, damage to collections, and loss of personal space became for him that internal crisis which is rarely described in documents, but which can be read between the lines. A man who for many years managed a bank, enterprises, the country's finances, faced the fact that power could not protect what he considered a part of the family's soul. And although no direct letters where he describes his emotional state have been preserved, his actions after the war can be interpreted as evidence of a profound change. It is important to emphasize this as an assumption, not a fact. Edouard, having survived the war, began to look at Ferrières differently. The house ceased to be a symbol of luxury and became a reminder of fragility. Even his attempts to recover lost works of art, and a portion of the collections was indeed returned to the family after the war thanks to the work of restitution commissions, did not restore the original meaning. Ferrières remained a castle that outwardly stood as before, but inwardly became a symbol of rupture. It is this moment that is important to consider as the beginning of a transformation of purpose, from a demonstration of power to the preservation of heritage. After Edouard's death in 1949, the fate of the castle fell into the hands of his daughter, Béatrice Ephrussi de Rothschild, and other heirs, but the key turning point was a decision made by the next generation. In 1959, the family donated Château de Ferrières to the University of Paris, a gesture that was officially recorded. This was not merely an act of generosity. It was the family's relinquishment of the private use of one of its most symbolic properties, a gesture transforming the private into the public, power into service. Here again, the importance of the second character from the previous section, Germaine Halphen, emerges. Although she passed away in the mid-20th century, her role in preserving family ties and archives proved critically important for the heirs to be able to decide not to restore its former splendor, but to transfer Ferrières to the educational sphere. There is no evidence in documents that she directly influenced the act of donation itself, but her support for the family during their exile allowed for the preservation of a basis for re-evaluation. The family could view the house not only as a lost symbol, but as a part of France's cultural history. Thus, the crisis experienced by Ferrières transformed into a point of transcendence. The chateau, built as an instrument of social display, became an instrument of public good. The Rothschilds' personal project transformed into a gift to the future. And in this decision, a transition from status to meaning, The house, once emptied, finally received a new purpose: to serve not the failed return of the past, but the education and culture of the next generation. It was in this way that Ferrières stepped beyond the family's personal history and became a part of collective memory. When Ferrières transitioned from private ownership to public space, its history seemed to get a chance to be rewritten anew. But it is important to understand, no gesture of donation erases the past. The castle, surrounded by a park, holding within its walls echoes of diplomatic conversations, sounds of occupational footsteps, and the silence of post-war desolation, could not simply transform into an educational building. It remained a bearer of memory, even if its function changed. The transfer to the University of Paris became an act that can be interpreted on two levels. On the one hand, it was a gesture of trust and respect towards French society. On the other, an acknowledgement that the family was no longer able or willing to retain a private past where it no longer served the future. Symbolically, Ferrières ceased to be a mark of class superiority, but became a place where knowledge and culture could exist outside of ownership. Its halls, where balls and political negotiations once took place, began to host students, conferences, researchers. It is in this context that the house acquires a new role. Not a guarded relic of the elite, but a space where heritage becomes accessible. However, the true strength of this decision lies in its demonstration of the flexibility of what seemed forever frozen. Where once the names of bankers, ministers, generals resonated, now the voices of young people who came to learn echoed. This is not just a change in function, it is a change in the concept of value. But the history of Ferrières did not end there. In the second half of the 20th century, and especially in the early 21st, the castle once again acquired a special form of presence in society. It became a venue for cultural events, academic projects, a center where the past was used as a stage for the future. Such a transformation would not have been possible without a long process of reconciliation with its own past. The house did not hide its scars, but made them part of its identity. It is fundamentally important that the new role did not destroy the old. Ferrières did not become a museum in the narrow sense. It became a living organism that carries memory, yet is capable of development. And here arises the key final question. Can architecture live through the fate of its owners and yet transcend it? The history of Ferrières answers in the affirmative. The house, created as a symbol of strength, survived a time when that strength proved illusory. It survived exile, occupation, emptiness, loss of meaning. It outlived generations whose personal tragedies were reflected on its walls, and yet it did not collapse, neither physically nor symbolically. It changed. In this change lies a lesson, that heritage is not defined by who owns it, but by how it is used. The Rothschild family, having gone through losses and transformations, was able to turn its own history into a public resource. And in this gesture, perhaps, lies their most significant achievement. The house ceased to be proof of status, but became proof that even the most private spaces can find a path to a common future. The finale of Ferrières' story is not an end, but a transition. Today, the castle continues to live between past and present, between memory and function, between the private destiny of a family and the collective destiny of society. It reminds us that grandeur can be fragile, but meaning is far more enduring than walls. And that sometimes the most valuable thing one can do with a legacy is to release it into the world.